In October of 2024, the PBS Idea channel on YouTube released a playlist of videos describing a series of logical fallacies and explicitly instructed its viewers to link the appropriate video in replies to their debate opponents when engaged in online argument.
Some of the most common fallacies, flaws in logic that can appear airtight even though they're not. But in the doobly-doo and in a playlist on Idea Channel's channel page, you will find one video for each fallacy. This way, when you do locate a fallacy out in the wild, you can direct the person who's deployed it to a source, letting them know the faultiness of their ways and encouraging them to do better, because we know that they are capable.
What followed was more than a decade of pretentious Redditors, not too dissimilar from myself, condescendingly explaining to their opponents that their arguments were invalid on their face because they had deployed the dreaded logical fallacy, while most of the time actually misusing the fallacy in question. If we're being honest, the Redditors probably would have done all that same thing anyway, but for the purposes of a video essay, we have to pretend that the two things are related. But we have to go back further to circa 1323 through 1326, when friend of the channel William of Ockham released Summa Logica, parts 3 through 4, of fallacies. He detailed the fallacies of equivocation, ambiguity of grammar, composition and diversion, accent, figure of speech, accent, consequent, second quid, missing the point, begging the question, false cause, and complex question. William of Ockham built on logical fallacies during the medieval ages, but he was building on the work of Aristotle, who divided 13 fallacies into two groups: fallacies dependent on language and fallacies independent of language. For the next 700 years, the canon of logical fallacies would morph and reshape into infographics galore, which now primarily adorn the walls of language arts classrooms. But now, in the year of our Lord 2026, can we finally admit most logical fallacies are kind of shit? When I say that a logical fallacy is bad, what I mean more specifically is that like 90% of the time, when someone accuses their debate opponent of using a logical fallacy, it's causing more harm than good. Either the person misunderstands what the logical fallacy means, or they're accusing the opponent unfairly of that, or when the opponent responds, the opponent is accusing the other person of misunderstanding the fallacy, in which case the debate is more about arguing about what the logical fallacy means than actually engaging in the debate, or some other combination of issues that I'm about to detail for the rest of this video. To be clear, I actually think there is value in learning what the logical fallacies are, at least if you learn them properly and correctly. I just don't think you should employ that as a tool in a debate, because the problem with logical fallacies as a category is it's lumping together a few different categories that are really distinct and making it ambiguous what error you're actually committing, because the category can refer to anything from strict errors in deduction to you don't like what the person's argument is to cognitive biases, and these are subtly different things. There may be some edge cases in certain kinds of dialectics where like you're using the fallacy as a shorthand and it's okay to refer to this or that fallacy, but that's surely less than 10% of the time. So what I'm going to do now is go through the different types of logical fallacies people bring up and what my problem are with them. One problem with logical fallacies that's not really a problem with the fallacies themselves, but it's a problem with the broader institution, is that most of them have really horrible names. For example, the classic Mott and Bailey. Most people don't know what a Mott is, they don't know what a Bailey is, and if they do know what those two things are, they know it entirely based on the fallacy. It would have been so easy to just name it a bait and switch fallacy or something like that. As for me, I know what a Mott and Bailey is from reading in the 3rd grade eyewitness books Castle, Discover the Mysteries of the Medieval Castle, and See What Life Was Like for Though. We are not the same. A worse case of logical fallacies is the appeal to ignorance, where you basically can't accuse your debate opponent of making an appeal to ignorance because it sounds incredibly insulting, like you're accusing them of being ignorant, when in fact it's like this tricky thing where you're saying that they're making the error of assuming that because there's no evidence on either side, then that means that we should take their position to be the truth. But of all the logical fallacies, the one that bothers me the most in this case is the genetic fallacy, which has just the worst name because it sounds like you're accusing the other person of appealing to genetics, when in fact it's like doesn't have anything to do with that. It may even be the opposite of that. And it bothers me because I unironically want to use this one. I want to like accuse people of making the genetic fallacy, but I can't. Fortunately, this one is also called the fallacy of origins, but I don't know anyone who calls it that. To be honest though, like this one is a total mess. Even the first sentence of the Wikipedia page for the genetic fallacy is technically wrong, because the first sentence makes it sound like it's some sort of inverse appeal to authority. In fact, it's something much broader than that. It's saying that we take something to be good or bad based on like the source of that thing being good or bad. Even one of the quotes in the Wikipedia page contradicts the definition given in the first sentence of the Wikipedia page. It gives this quote about like, hey, you're wearing a wedding ring. Doesn't that mean you believe in patriarchy? Because don't you know that wedding rings originally were worn to symbolize the chains that women wore to prevent them from running away from their husbands? That's a genetic fallacy, because it's saying just because that cultural practice has an origin somewhere else, that its current practice is the same way, when it has nothing to do with that. That's far broader than just saying that a claim is wrong because the claim originated from an untrustworthy source. The internet loves logical fallacies, and one of its favorite logical fallacies to accuse is the ad hominem fallacy. You're in a debate, you're arguing about whether green beans are healthy, and your debate opponent says, "How can you say that green beans are healthy when, look at you, you are fat?" And you say, aha, you have engaged in the ad hominem fallacy because you are judging based on the properties of the speaker, not based on whether the argument is true or false. My argument, green beans are healthy, that is valid regardless of whether or not you think I'm fat or not. Maybe I just don't eat green beans. So it's a logical error. And look at you now, you have a shine on you because you've risen above. You have remained calm and logical and rational. Meanwhile, you've subtly pointed out that your debate opponent is a mean guy and he has made a horrible argument, which indeed is incorrect. For the most part, I'm actually okay with this logical fallacy being a thing. But there is some nuance to this. For example, if the debate proposition itself has a reference to one or more of the debate participants, then referencing some property of one of the debate participants is not necessarily fallacious. For example, let's say the debate question was about explicitly whether or not, like, who has the better diet, then pointing out that one of the people is fat, in that case, it's not fallacious because it directly goes to the debate proposition. I don't know why you would want to debate that specific topic, but regardless, that's an exception. And I don't even want to open the can of worms of like, better for that person versus better for everyone, or what does better even mean in this context, but at the very least, it is like a relevant piece of evidence. The problem is, how do we actually decide if we're in that situation? Like, what if there's a personal trainer who claims that anyone who follows his program will get fit? Is it a fallacy to point out that that personal trainer is himself, like, obese? If the personal trainer follows their own program and they're not fit, then it's valid to point that out because, yeah, it goes to their claim. Then they could say, well, I don't follow my program, but if I did, I would be fit. Then what do? Then you could have a separate argument about like whether it's a good idea to listen to this fitness influencer, as in, do they practice what they preach, or does it matter? Or does the fact that they don't follow their own program speak to their lack of discipline, and does that speak negatively up to them as a person? On the other hand, I may have picked a bad example because I hate the culture of like fitness YouTube where we judge whether or not to listen to someone based on how much muscles they have. The truth is that most of the time, both debate participants are already rolling in the mud. The debate is really about who is the better person anyway, and invoking this fallacy is a kind of false advertising, like it's making the claim that you're the one who's above it all, which everyone rolls their eyes at because you made an ad hominem yourself like 5 minutes ago. There's a fine line between the good version and the bad version of some of these things. For example, with moving the goalposts, you could say in a way it's sort of a good thing because isn't that what you're supposed to do in debate? If you hear an argument that contradicts what you believed before, then you shouldn't just stubbornly fix yourself to your prior belief. You should be willing to change your mind when presented with arguments you hadn't considered. So if you're moving the goalpost, then a lot of times it's just saying, hey, I concede to that point that you just made. However, here's this other consideration, or here's this other point, or here's this other reason for my believing that thing. Or here's a similar argument that I also need to consider. And there's no problem in principle with doing that. The only problem is if they don't also concede that they were wrong about their prior argument. So it is a formal fallacy if you're thinking about whether the person is willing to concede based on arguments or whether they're willing to sweep that under the rug and pretend it doesn't happen, but there is a good version of it. Another similar thing to that is the Gish Gallop. So the Gish Gallop is technically not like a logical fallacy, it is an argumentative technique. And I'm going to talk about in a second, like, the distinction between those things. So the Gish Gallop, if you're treating it from a strictly logical standpoint, it's not problematic to give many different reasons for believing in something and to give many different points of evidence. The only problem is really it just comes with the format of the debate, that you're taking advantage of the fact that your opponent doesn't have enough time to respond to all of your points. But that's not a problem with the logic. That's just a problem with the format of the debate and how the time slots are allocated, that your opponent doesn't have enough time to respond. Of course, it's also paired with making incorrect arguments that need to be responded to, but that's a value judgment. That's not like an intrinsic thing. It's always wrong to give incorrect arguments. Where it becomes a gish gallop is based on the timing of it, but that's not like a logical problem, because giving multiple different reasons for believing something, even if you do it really quickly, that should in principle be good if the reasons you're giving are good. You can think of a situation where all of the points you're making are correct, and yet you still get accused of making a gish gallop because like the way that you deliver your points is in such rapid succession that you're just not giving your opponent time to respond. But that's kind of a problem with your opponent, right? That's not really that you made a fallacy of a gish gallop. And I can see how maybe you still made the gish gallop unless you define the gish gallop as something which is like you're by definition giving incorrect points. But it's sort of unfair to me to have such a thing as an argumentative technique that has baked into the definition that you're incorrect. Because yes, of course, you're always wrong if you're incorrect. So, I don't know, it's a bit redundant to say that. Speaking of the appeal to authority fallacy, maybe you'll take it on my authority that there's no logical fallacy that's been subject to more debate about what exactly it means. Tell me if you heard this debate before. According to this scientist, it proves that I'm right. Oh yeah? Well, you troglodyte haven't even realized that you committed the appeal to authority fallacy. No, I haven't. The appeal to authority fallacy is only a fallacy if the authority in question is not a valid authority. No, what are you talking about? It's literally called the appeal to authority fallacy. The appeal to authority fallacy is the short name. The full name is the appeal to an unqualified authority. Well, instead of just telling me that you read a book with something in it, why don't you regurgitate what it says and then we can have a debate about what the authority actually thinks. Okay, that was a little fun to do. Now we can watch some of these asinine debates play out.
Wait, you can learn from this. You can learn something. Do you think it's a fallacy? Do you think it is a fallacy to appeal to the authority of a physicist when speaking on the legitimacy of issues concerning physics?
I'm not saying that when you have two laymen discussing physics and they don't know what they're talking about, and physicist X says this, then that's not a useful input into the conversation, but it is a fallacious argument.
Well, it's actually incredible to me that somebody could be politically relevant for online this long and not know the basic definition of a fallacy that you could Google and learn. I think I've seen infographics meant to be digested by 8th graders that have a more nuanced understanding of this topic than he does.
Okay, let's do some Googling and learning. So I Googled it, and the first link that showed up is Wikipedia, and I get all my knowledge from Wikipedia because I'm just dumb that way, so let me read from Wikipedia, okay? While all sources agree this is not a valid form of logical proof and therefore obtaining knowledge in this way is fallible, there is disagreement on the general extent to which it is fallible. Historically, opinion on the appeal to authority has been divided. It is listed as a non-fallacious argument and often as a fallacious argument in various sources. Some consider it a practical and sound way of obtaining knowledge that is generally likely to be correct when the authority is real, pertinent, and universally accepted, while others consider it to be a very weak, defeasible argument or an outright fallacy. Curious. So it's disputed, and I actually think at the time of this conversation the Wikipedia page said it was contested, and some people think it's a fallacy only under certain conditions, while other people think it's a fallacy regardless of whether or not the authority you're appealing to is a real authority. Okay, I'm gonna settle this once and for all, although it's not really something you have to take my authority on because you only need to scroll a little bit further in the Wikipedia page and it details this for you. But regardless, I knew this before reading the Wikipedia page, so give me some credit, okay? It depends on whether you're using deductive logic or inductive logic. If you're using inductive logic, then it's only a fallacy under certain conditions. If you're using deductive logic, then it's always a fallacy regardless of the authority in question. So it's technically true that it is only a fallacy under certain conditions, but the sort of umbrella of the type of logic you're using dictates whether that's even possible. So just as a reminder, deductive logic is like formal logic with syllogisms and all that. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Whereas inductive logic is working with like evidentiary logic. Every swan I have ever seen is white, therefore probably all swans are white. Yes, I know it's more complicated than that. Those are just examples. No, I won't be taking criticisms on those descriptions. In the inductive logic case, you're just working with evidence, and the fact that a high-ranking authority said something is sort of to be treated as a kind of evidence because the fact that he said that or she said that is more likely under the case where it's true than under the case where it's false. So it's treated as evidence. I'm gonna be honest though, guys, I do think there actually is something improper about appealing to authority, even in the ideal case when you're using inductive logic and it's a valid and relevant authority. If anything, it's just out of laziness. If you're saying that an authority believes something, why is that the case? It's probably because the authority has thought through arguments in favor of the thing, or the authority has seen evidence in favor of the thing, or otherwise the authority has some reason to believe the thing. If that's the case, then saying that the authority believes something is at best just a shorthand or a pointer. It's saying there elsewhere is this authority's brain who wrote it, or the book that he wrote about that, and you should go elsewhere to read that book. But as a replacement for that, you could theoretically list out the reasons the authority has for believing the thing, or present the evidence on the table that convince the authority, or bring up the arguments that are in the book. And it gets to the question of the norm of the debate and what you want the norm of the debate to be. In my opinion, in a debate, you kind of should do that. What is the point of the debate? If it's to litigate, like, who has the best reputation, then appealing to an authority is kind of circular, because the whole point of the debate is to figure out who is an authority in the first place. But if the point of the debate is to like granularly go through the evidence and find out the material reasons for believing the thing, then I believe you should go into a lot of detail there. You should be able to unpack like the detailed evidence that you have, the reasons that you have. In the best case where it's allowed, you're just sort of pushing the debate to the right, because now you're stuck arguing the meta question on whether or not the person that you cited is a relevant authority, and it's like a snake eating its own tail. Wouldn't it be more useful to get into the actual material facts as far as the reason that person thinks that? The existence of the slippery slope fallacy is very contentious. I often see conservatives and traditionalists argue against it in the context of attacking progressives. Did you see that politician who in his platform he wants to make cats legal to own? That's ridiculous. If we make cats legal, next thing we know, saber-toothed tigers will be running around legal as well. No, just because cats are legal doesn't mean that saber-toothed tigers will also be running around. That's a slippery slope fallacy. Okay, it's 10 years later, and the proposition passed, cats were made legal, and what do you know? Now we have saber-toothed tigers running around everywhere. Just like you said wouldn't happen. So much for the so-called slippery slope fallacy. Well, of course making cats legal would make saber-toothed tigers legal. No one ever said otherwise. And that person you just had a second ago saying that it was a fallacy, no one actually said that. You just made him up for the purpose of this skit. I'm actually gonna read from Wikipedia again, because this is a pretty good summary. It says, in a slippery slope argument, a course of action is rejected because the slippery slope advocate believes it will lead to a chain reaction, resulting in an undesirable end or ends. The core of the slippery slope argument is that a specific decision under debate is likely to result in unintended consequences. The strength of such an argument depends on whether the small step really is likely to lead to the effect. This is quantified in terms of what is known as the warrant, in this case, a demonstration of the process that leads to the significant effect. This type of argument is sometimes used as a form of fear-mongering, in which the probable consequences of a given action are exaggerated in an attempt to scare the audience. When the initial step is not demonstrably likely to result in the claimed effects, this is called the slippery slope fallacy. This is a type of informal fallacy and a subject of continuum fallacy, in that it ignores the possibility of middle ground and assumes a discrete transition from category A to category B. In the example I gave, people are arguing over whether a certain policy, if enacted, will lead to a good or bad thing happening down the line. Now, if you're arguing over whether a policy will lead to a good or bad conclusion, then the idea that down the line it could lead to a bad thing, that actually is relevant, that's not inherently fallacious. However, the only difference between the two people is that one side believes that the policy will lead to that conclusion, the other person thinks that it won't lead to that conclusion. So it's just a disagreement in terms of the prediction of what they think will happen. The Wikipedia page doesn't say this, but the slippery slope fallacy is a fallacy of weak induction, which means, unlike fallacies where the premise has nothing to do with the conclusion, actually the premise is relevant to the conclusion. The only problem is that the premise doesn't support the conclusion strongly enough. Cards on the table, I hate the slippery slope fallacy. Of course, it is fallacious to assert that because it's possible that a certain bad outcome will result from a policy, then it's inevitably going to happen. That's fallacious. But here's the problem. It's also fallacious to argue that it's inevitably not going to happen. You have to weigh the probabilities of which one's going to happen more. And it's okay for two people to disagree. And also, if someone thinks that a policy will lead to a bad outcome and they're wrong about that, they're overestimating the possibility of that happening, or they're just confused about like what's going on and it could never lead to that, then yes, they're wrong, but I hesitate to call that a fallacy. Is someone being wrong a fallacy? And is someone being wrong about a particular topic a fallacy? I don't know if I would use that word. Like with a lot of other fallacies, even of weak induction, I can see how someone would see this as a fallacy. Like the fallacy of weak analogy. Yeah, okay, I can see how there's a certain failure mode where someone makes analogies that are weak. But the idea that someone like predicts an outcome that's not actually realistic, that's just them being wrong. Is that like a fallacy? I don't know. People can be wrong all the time. If someone is wrong and someone has a wrong premise, the solution is to challenge their premise and point out why they're wrong. This is how it works for all arguments. Why do we need to tag this specific scenario with its own fallacy? It seems a little silly to me. But maybe I'm just not getting on board with the premise behind fallacies of weak induction. Like another fallacy that has similar properties is the fallacy of hasty generalization. Now, it is a fallacy to assume that like a small sample is necessarily representative of a larger generalization, but it's also a fallacy to assume it's never representative, that you can never make generalizations. People can make generalizations, and whether or not those generalizations are hasty is more like a value judgment. It's kind of like your opinion, man. Like, you can't skip the work of actually arguing one way or the other that here's why my generalization is hasty, or here's why it's not. I don't think I would have that much of a problem if people understood how these fallacies worked and the difference between different kinds of fallacies, and actually put in the work of adjudicating whether or not something was hasty or not. But a lot of people, the way that they treat fallacies, it's a bit of a misunderstanding. It's like you're treating these things as hard rules. Like, if you make an argument in a certain form that says X will lead to Y, then you have committed the slippery slope fallacy and you're automatically wrong. Or if you make an argument of the form, this small example is like representative of a larger trend, you have committed the hasty generalization fallacy and you're automatically wrong. But that's not how it works. You're not automatically wrong just because your argument has that format, because these aren't like rigid, formal logic rules. They're more like certain failure modes. In fact, slippery slope, it's more like a argumentative or like debate tactic where you can pass off in a debate like a certain conclusion is inevitable because of the format of a debate. And this is the thing about fallacies of weak induction, is they're looping together things that are quasi-debate tactics with these like weird fuzzy sources of disagreement like hasty generalization, and you're looping that in with things like false cause, which is more like a reasoning error. So false cause I think of as being more like a cognitive bias where people tend to over-attribute causations to things. Like, if you take your kid to get vaccinated and then your kid gets sick, then you associate the vaccine as causing the sickness, but just because thing X happens before thing Y, that doesn't mean that thing X causes thing Y. It's sort of similar to confusing correlation with causation. People can confuse the chronology of things with the causation. So maybe it's a cognitive bias, but is it a logical fallacy? I don't know about that. I think as far as the logical fallacy credentials, it runs into some of the same problems as before, where, well, sometimes things can be causes, so you need to actually make an argument for what is the evidence that this thing is a cause. You can't skip that step, despite the fact that there is like a cognitive bias attached to this mode of reasoning. What I don't like is based on the fact that people treat these as hard, like formal logic rules, that often logical fallacies function essentially as thought-terminating cliches. For example, in debates, it is a very useful technique to make analogies to things. Now, obviously, an analogy can be good or bad, depending on what it demonstrates and whether it's relevant to the debate being had. And it's perfectly fair to attack an analogy on those grounds, or even like refuse to answer it because you think that it's like a bad analogy, but in a lot of circles where people are encouraged to list out fallacies or like appeal to fallacies all the time, what you're gonna see is someone makes an analogy and then someone else drops in a quick reply and says like, oh, false analogy, you've committed a logical fallacy. But just saying false analogy, it's not in itself an argument, it's just a thought-terminating cliche. If you look up a list of logical fallacies online, which a lot of people do, then you'll get back a list of some things which are actually formal like logic errors, such as affirming the consequent, which you can evaluate more formally, and some things which are more like debate tactics, like poisoning the well, and then some things that are more like cognitive biases, like sunk cost fallacy. Actually, sunk cost fallacy is a bit more interesting. It's like assuming that if you flip 10 heads in a row, then the next coin that you flip must be tails, because what are the chances of flipping 11 heads in a row? But no, the fact that you already flipped the 10 heads means that you have to deal with those separately because they're already known, and so if you're predicting the future thing, then what happened in the past won't necessarily predict the next coin you flip because they're independent variables. However, this can get a lot trickier, like how many times are you dealing with independent variables? So yes, the sunk cost fallacy is true formally, like in the situations that it's specifically for, it's technically valid. But the tricky part is determining whether you're actually in one of those situations, because real life situations have a lot more variables that makes it a lot more complex. And maybe the like so-called cognitive bias that leads us to give the wrong answers on some problems leads us to give the right answer on a lot more problems. The blogger Gwern has a long and really detailed blog post where he breaks down the sunk cost fallacy and details like how in a lot of cases it's not actually a fallacy. He makes the point that in a lot of cases it's not even really a cognitive bias, so I'd encourage you to read that. The knowledge and popularity of the straw man fallacy has probably done more good than harm on the internet. However, there's a class of creators that has found a way to sort of weaponize the straw man fallacy, where whenever you try to represent their view back to them, because that's what you should do in any proper debate, in order to rebut your opponent, you have to make sure first that you understand their belief. But whenever you try to summarize their belief back to them, they're just going to endlessly reply that you're not understanding it correctly, and surely if you did understand their view, then you would agree with them, because the only possible reason someone could be disagreeing with you is because they don't understand you properly. Like, at a certain point, it's either you're just bad at communication, and you're horrible at representing your view, or you're just using that as a sort of debate tactic to ward off any legitimate attacks, because anytime someone attacks your view, you can again say that they just don't understand it. Now, to be fair, maybe for some like niche topics, this actually is true. Like maybe if you're studying advanced physics or some advanced economics concept, then maybe a lot of people who come to you just don't understand your view. But like, that's sort of on you at the same time. Like, you have to be able to explain your view and like teach people through this, and you can tell like whether that's what's happening or not. Like, you can tell whether this is a legitimate academic who's studying advanced physics or something versus two people with like relatively the same credentials who are arguing something out, and no matter how hard of an effort one side makes to try to represent the view correctly, they're always going to get some minor thing wrong. The way I would describe it is that for a lot of these logical fallacies, not like strict logic error fallacies, but logical fallacies where there's an error to be made on either extreme. If you go on one extreme, then you're going to make one error. If you go on another extreme, you're going to make another error. Well, maybe the logic error itself, maybe the logical fallacy is tuned to specifically avoid one extreme. So the popularity or lack of popularity of that logical fallacy can give certain kinds of arguments an additional cachet. Like, for example, with the straw man fallacy, now if you accuse your opponent of making a straw man, it gives you certain rhetorical cachet because people know what that is. So that might avoid like an error that you make on one extreme, but then on the other extreme of just weaponizing that strategy, that's not avoided. I wish there was a term for this strategy, except there sort of is. Like, it's called obscurantism. But how do you make that into a fallacy? The obscurantism fallacy? Another example is the weak man fallacy. So, like, the straw man fallacy is when you basically misrepresent your opponent's position. The weak man fallacy is when you take a position that someone legitimately actually does hold, but you find the worst version of it, or you find like the dumbest person making the worst argument you've ever heard in favor of that position, and then you argue, you react against that position, you react to that person and say, they're so dumb, they're making such a dumb argument, and you use that to discredit the position. And this is pretty common online, on YouTube making React content. It was pretty common, probably still is. But the problem with that is you get the same issue where, for example, my most popular video right now is the AI safety one, and the biggest piece of criticism that I got was that, like, there were certain arguments that I didn't address. And that's a good example because, yeah, I think that's a valid critique, right? There are always going to be certain arguments that you don't address, but I feel like it doesn't take a lot of effort to make that critique because there's always going to be it's impossible to address every single argument, and despite the fact that it was like an hour-and-a-half video, if it touches on such complex topics like AI engineering and philosophy and predicting the future, then it's just such a wide subject area that there's no way you could possibly touch on everything. So you can kind of do this with every argument that someone makes, is if someone rebuts a certain argument, you can say, well, but here's this other argument that you didn't rebut. And that's true, like, and I can hear out new and better arguments, but then that's just a continuation of the conversation. And as for the first part, you just have to accept that it's only going to be able to have enough time to rebut some of the arguments that are made. Now we come to what I think is the most interesting logical fallacy, the no true Scotsman fallacy. No Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. But my Uncle Angus is a Scotsman and he puts sugar on his porridge. No true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge.
If you don't believe that there is to be an apocalypse, there is going to be an end, a separation of the sheep and the goats, a condemnation, a final one, then you're not really a believer.
I'm not even hating on Hitchens here. It's been argued that he wasn't even claiming that was true. He was criticizing his opponent for supposedly believing that. I don't know if I buy it, but I digress. I think the no true Scotsman fallacy opens up like Pandora's box to a whole category of reasoning errors, but I sort of hate it as a fallacy because it creates this tight and restricted box for it, and just the way it's treated and the way that it's taught, it's treated like this strange and edge case idiosyncratic thing. And when you accuse someone of using the no true Scotsman fallacy, it seems so strange because it seems like the problem is you shouldn't accuse people of not being a true Scotsman. Like, what? I never wanted to do that in the first place. If you'll indulge me, I need to go over a little bit of philosophy here. So let's say your neighbor calls you a fascist. So you assert, of course, that you're not a fascist. I'm not a fascist because I don't believe in those things at all. But then when you dig into what your neighbor actually means when he's calling you a fascist, it turns out, when you dig into it, that by fascist, your neighbor literally means someone with a mustache, who's 5'11", who bikes to work, who lives in Arkansas, who has big glasses, who has a dog named Spots. And so he's lined up all these traits and saying, if you have this and this and this and this, then you're a fascist. And guess what? It just so happens that there's only one person in the world who has that exact combination of traits. It's you. So he has this definition of fascism which is narrowly tailored to you. You rightly would not accept this. You would reject this argument. You would say that your neighbor has created a definition of fascism which is hyper-specific and fine-tuned. But, so here's the issue though, right? From a pure philosophical standpoint, your neighbor is technically making a valid argument in the sense that the conclusions follow from the premises, right? That's to say, if someone has a stipulated definition, that is, in this case, that a fascist is someone with certain properties, being 5'11", living in Arkansas, etc., and as long as you indisputably meet those properties, then yes, technically by that definition, you are a fascist. So in formal logic, non-logical symbols are treated as arbitrary by the model. And if you know programming, you can think of this like when you're defining a variable, you can essentially define a variable to any arbitrary value, regardless of what the name of the variable is. Now, a human reading that can say that the name of the variable doesn't meet the value, but that's like a human judgment. The compiler doesn't care. It treats the word as just some arbitrary value. And you can do this with any word. You can invent your own arbitrary word, arbitrary symbol, or arbitrarily rename like any word in the English language to mean something else, as long as you're being consistent internally with your model and how you use that word. So I think that makes sense so far, and this is actually a core principle that all philosophers pretty much understand. At the same time though, I don't think that there's nothing to criticize there, meaning we shouldn't just throw up our hands and declare terminological defeat. Your neighbor is still doing something intellectually dishonest. He's using a word in a blatantly non-standard way. And this is a manipulative tactic because this is an intentionally confusing increasing use of language. He wants you to face all the consequences of being a fascist, because there's a certain value judgment associated with whether you are or not. But the statement that you are is only true in like his technical sense, which is only true locally. When philosophers claim that a statement is tautologically true, then it's usually not a compliment. It's often a criticism that the claim is, like, in other words, vacuously true. The conclusion is just a restatement of the definition, so it's really not helpful in any meaningful way. In that case, you're using language to attack, but you can also use language to praise in the same way. Like, let's say you're defining the word generous to mean someone who takes care of my grandmother, and it's only someone who takes care of specifically my grandmother. If you take care of anyone else's grandmother, then it doesn't count. Well, then I can say I'm the only generous person in the world. People would not look too kindly on that as well. You see this a lot in political movements, where my ideological movement is an environment where only good things happen, and your ideological movement is an environment where only bad things happen. And if you want to know which regime we're living in, just look out the window. Are good things happening or are bad things happening? Well, if bad things are happening, then obviously we're living under your horrible movement. And all the good things that have been achieved by my ideological movement, because, well, that's true by definition, right? My ideological movement is by definition the good one. And if you think that my ideological movement is bad, you just don't understand it, because you don't understand that my movement is by definition the good one. So how can you possibly be against that other than if you're ignorant to what my movement is actually about? I see a lot of times people want to criticize each other on the basis that I described earlier of making vacuous arguments, but they don't really know how to do it. For example, recently I was debating someone about AGI, or artificial general intelligence. So there's a lot of disagreement on what AGI actually means. And I made a claim. I said that I thought something was true about AGI, but I may think that because I defined the term in a certain way. And so my debate opponent accused me of begging the question. So was I begging the question? Was I committing a logical fallacy? Well, yes and no. So begging the question is when an argument assumes its own conclusion. For example, begging the question is when you say, I know God exists because the Bible says so, and I know I can trust the Bible because it was written by God. So these are sometimes called circular arguments. Is it begging the question when a conclusion is downstream from the definitions of words being stipulated? Well, yes and no. So it's in the very nature of arguments that they are reasoning about words, and virtually all arguments depend on word definitions as their bedrock. So if that is a fallacy, then virtually all arguments are fallacies. And what the person, my debate opponent, wanted to say, what I think he wanted to accuse me of, but the problem is that the language of logical fallacies doesn't give us a good understanding for talking about this, is he wanted to accuse me of making a vacuous claim, in other words. At the core of it, the disagreement is a question about contrived definitions. Are you using a contrived definition or a properly understood definition? So, am I giving a contrived definition of AGI, or is he giving a contrived definition of AGI? He was really doing the same thing without really knowing it, because in arguing the opposite conclusion as me, my debate opponent was utilizing a definition of AI for himself, just a different one than mine. Either he was doing this, or he was just arguing something ambiguous, because if you don't define your terms, then your statements are going to be ambiguous. So the real question is, which of our definitions makes more sense, is more narrowly tailored to like making a certain point, or is more contrived, or should we use more broadly? And that's something we need to discuss and like actually argue out and understand what we mean. Just accusing of making a logical fallacy is like true, but it's not. So this is really a cursed problem because there are entire fields of philosophy dedicated to thinking about how we construct categories and how we define words. Because they're really related problems. What are words but categories that we use to refer to certain kinds of agreed upon classes of concepts or things? The way that I think about it that helps me a lot is in terms of clustering algorithms. So these are computer algorithms. Let's say you have a series of data of points in n-dimensional space. Each of these points represents an object, a concept, whatever. And the points can be closer to each other or further away from each other. The problem is that there are so many dots that in order to make general statements, we need to create categories which refer to many dots at the same time. And it would be convenient if these categories were arranged, taking proximity into account so that each new dot that appears, we can predict what category it would be in. An example of a clustering algorithm is k-means clustering. That means that we want to divide the data into k clusters, and there's a specific algorithm for deciding what data goes in what cluster. The choice of how we analyze the raw data is subjective. That's to say, someone has to decide whether to use k-means clustering as their clustering algorithm or some other clustering algorithm or whatever. However, once the algorithm has been selected, then the process of actually applying the algorithm is actually objective because it's just math. But usually we don't let math derive the words for us from scratch. For an abstract word, if you surveyed 100 people, you'd get a bunch of different responses for things which would or wouldn't fit under the definition. The job of the definition is to cleanly separate what is understood to fall under that definition versus what isn't. For an analogy, let's say we have a bunch of points which are pre-labeled into one of two colors, and the job of the machine learning algorithm is to draw a line separating the two colors. This is like figuring out the distinction between two words, or deciding what should be included in the word's definition versus what should be excluded. But here's the nuance, is you don't actually want to give the machine learning algorithm too much flexibility to work with, because you can end up with a situation like you have on the right of this picture, which is called overfitting, with that squiggly, really contrived looking line. And this is like gerrymandering the concept to precisely fit exactly your pre-labels instead of forming a clean label. So with the examples that I criticized earlier as linguistic misuse, the examples that were made were a kind of overfitting to your preconceptions. When we think about what makes a good definition, we value the conciseness and the clarity of the definition. The definition acts like a clean slice. On the other hand, if your definition of fascism is a long list of narrowly tailored criteria, that's more like overfitting. So you prejudge certain points as being one way or the other, and now you need to make things more complicated to justify that initial claim. It's the same sort of problem when people define intellectual movements in such a way that everything they like belongs to the intellectual movement they're a part of, and everything they dislike is somehow magically excluded from that movement. If the intellectual movement was real, quote-unquote, like a commonly understood concept rather than a bespoke invention, then you would expect, if only by sheer accident, that it would include certain things that you disagree with. Maybe there are exceptions, like if your movement is some super cerebral thing where everything is downstream from one core unifying premise, and all the concepts are lined up ahead of time in that way, then yeah, maybe you can define it that way, and if you agree with the core unifying premise, then you don't really have any disagreements. But in the real world, it doesn't usually work out like that. Usually concepts are a lot more messy. This is how we make sense of the rather strange idiom of the exception which proves the rule. Why would an exception prove a rule? Isn't that contradictory to the nature of a rule? Well, here's the thing. If a rule is well formed, then you should expect certain so-called exceptions, or maybe points that violate your expectations. So things that actually fall within the rule or not, that you wouldn't necessarily expect, and the fact that those things exist just proves that you're working with the real world where exceptions exist, and that you're working with real categories, that is to say. Going back to the no true Scotsman fallacy, I think now it's a bit more clear what the actual error is. A person believes that no Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge, which is shown to be incorrect. The right response might be to admit that some Scotsmen do put sugar on their porridge, and there are exceptions to the original claim. But the person wants to have the power of his claim being built into the definition, so he's fallaciously baking in that specific trait into the definition of Scotsman, when in reality there's no reason that such a broad thing as Scotsman needs to include something so specific as whether you put sugar on your porridge. The problem I have with this subject is that in dialectics, we don't really have good language of talking about this category of like how we form definitions. The language of logical fallacies is woefully inadequate for the actual problem, and the best that we can do right now is these half-baked fallacies of so-called begging the question or so-called no true Scotsman, which make contact with the problem and yes, sort of have to do with that issue, but they're either too broad or too specific and not well equipped to be able to have these discussions well. We should be able to do a lot better than this. Okay, that's enough ranting about that. I'm making this video about logical fallacies, but I'm noticing in certain circles there already is sort of a backlash against excessively citing logical fallacies, but for different reasons. Like if you constantly bring up XYZ fallacy, then you get accused of being a debate-brained, logic-obsessed weirdo. But my reason for criticizing these fallacies is probably because I'm even more of a debate-brained, logic-obsessed weirdo. Usually in these anti-fallacy circles, it comes down to falling back on an appeal to emotion, like, come on man, you can't trap me in your dialogue tree, just like have some common sense, don't be a weirdo. And so, despite the title of this video, I'm wondering if my conclusion is gonna be, hey, maybe logical fallacies actually aren't so bad after all. Yeah, that's it, like and subscribe. No, okay, I have some more comments, but do like and subscribe. So what I'm going to do now is speedrun through some of the popular logical fallacies that I didn't have enough time to mention already. The black and white fallacy is C tier for me. I don't have any problem with strictly the black and white fallacy itself. However, what I do have a problem with is like 90% of the time when someone says, well, it's not so black and white. Probably it is black and white. I mean, what we're trying to do in debates is boil things down to claims which are either true or false. Now, sometimes we don't do that accurately, and there's other possibilities we're not considering, but if two people believe contradictory things, only one of them can be right, so I don't like the claim that, well, everyone's right or nobody's wrong here. That doesn't really have to do with the formal fallacy, but it's still, I think too many people get it confused. The fallacy, I think I give that a B tier. I like it. It's saying that just because your opponent committed a logical fallacy doesn't mean that their conclusion is necessarily wrong. It just means that their argument is wrong. The only reason I give it B tier is because I wish that people just understood the broader concept, which is just because your opponent makes an argument that is incorrect doesn't mean that their conclusion is incorrect. So fallacy is good. It's just too specific for me. Appeal to emotion, I give that a C tier. I mean, because it's not always really a fallacy, it's only a fallacy under certain conditions when the debate proposition isn't about emotions. But if the debate proposition is specifically about emotions, then talking about emotions isn't necessarily an appeal to emotions, and it's not a fallacy. So that's something to keep in mind. I guess I'm just not that enthralled with autistically listing out every little subcategory of non sequitur fallacy. I wish people just understood the broader concept of when a rebuttal is relevant or not, so C tier. The last one, appeal to nature, I give the naturalistic fallacy A tier. Your aunt who's really into alternative health, she posts something on Facebook about how you shouldn't take vaccines because they're not natural, and you pipe in saying, well, don't you know that the insects eat each other or something like that, and boom, you just won the argument. It's great fun. I think if there's one thing to take away is that logical fallacies are really a social construct, right? They're often listed as a discrete and complete series of here are the ways that you can fail in arguments. But that canon, that list, and how we decide what gets included and what gets excluded, that is itself sort of a social construct, right? Like we can add things, we can take away things, and this has happened over history. Over time, we've slowly added and added more items, and I've even seen recently, right? People have made the accusation of whataboutism. Well, whataboutism is usually not thought of as a logical fallacy, but I think it's much of a logical fallacy as all the others, right? It's usually referred to in place of one of two things. I think it means two possibilities depending on how you use it. Either whataboutism is replacing the non sequitur, so you're making a point, you're saying, here are my reasons, and then the debate opponent comes in and says, well, what about X? Have you considered X? And you're like, yeah, what about X? You know, make the argument of why I should consider X. Or maybe I already have considered X and decided it wasn't important. Tell me why X is important. What about it? That's whataboutism type 1. And type 2 is more like whataboutism as a replacement for the hypocrisy fallacy. So the hypocrisy fallacy is saying just because your opponent is a hypocrite doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. And I see a lot of times in political discussions, people will be arguing about something, and maybe you're like attacking a politician, and then the other side comes around and says, well, you can't attack that politician because your political party, they recently did something so horrible, so how can you support your political party? So you're trying to accuse the other side of being hypocrites because they're attacking your preferred candidate, but actually they are just as bad. So that's fallacious because regardless of whether or not the other political party is just as bad, that has no bearing on whether or not the politician did a good or bad thing. So often I hear the original person say, that is an example of whataboutism. You can't attack my party because you're just not responding to what I'm saying. So it's sort of also overlapping with non sequitur because they don't like how the point that they just made is not being responded to. But it also overlaps with hypocrisy fallacy. So you have this like Venn diagram of different errors that kind of overlap with each other, and depending on whether more people know about whataboutism, or more people know about what non sequitur is, or more people know about what the hypocrisy fallacy is. That's going to determine what is more or less common to reference, and that may even or may not shape the kinds of the debates that we have and what sorts of debate behaviors are considered taboo. I don't even think that the common canon of logical fallacies encompasses some of the most common errors that I see during debates. So I'm tempted to invent my own logical fallacies on the spot to describe those issues, but that's for a future video.